Now, joining me for analysis on the crisis in Ukraine is Lincoln Mitchell. He's an associate adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University in New York. Thanks very much for your time there, Lincoln. Now, I wanted to refer to an article on fair.org, a national media watch group, an article written by Bryce Green. He described the media coverage in the US and the gaping holes of context that seems to be missing, that the recent wave of Ukrainian pieces are missing crucial history, including US foreign policy goals in reference to foreign markets, the NATO drive to push up against Russia, US support for the 2014 coup, and what's described as the direct hand in shaping the new government. What's your take on these findings?
Well, the article is a good summary of kind of Moscow's talking points about this. But having said that, it is important to understand two things, to hold two ideas in our heads about this war at the same time, and that's not always easy, particularly in Washington. One is that Putin has played a destructive role on the world stage and continues to do that. The second is that there is some context here. And when we ignore that context, which we do in the United States frequently, the media says things, Putin is Hitler, which is frankly absurd, as bad as what he's doing is. Putin is a madman, which is a question for a psychologist, not a journalist. But that precludes getting to thoughtful analysis, thoughtful policy approaches. One of the reasons negotiations went so poorly is because we couldn't not make ourselves in a position of agreeing with Putin, but of even kind of seeing where he was coming from. Now, the question I would raise, having read that article and heard all those talking points many times, is first of all, there are some oversights, right? So the issue about the color revolutions, the United States playing a role in transitions, in expanding their influence through elections and that kind of thing, in Georgia, Ukraine, elsewhere, is very real. But on the other hand, all of those elections, the Russians were deeply involved in as well. This notion of a coup in 2014, that's pretty dramatic language. I mean, to refer to somebody who was shooting at a leader who was shooting at peaceful demonstrators and who was so deeply corrupt and stealing so much money. And by the way, Zelensky didn't come to power in that transition. He came to power years later, running as the moderate in an election that he won fairly. So the context is important. But the question I would raise for all that context is, okay, even if we take all that at face value, which we should not, why is Russia bombing Ukraine and killing innocent civilians?
Well, this article goes on to describe how during the tug of war between the US and Russia, the Americans were engaged in a destabilization campaign against the Yanukovych government, suggesting that the US helped to overthrow Ukraine's elected president. So I suppose that goes up against the idea that if Moscow had influence over, say, Canada or Mexico, then the US would be feeling pretty bad about that too.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, of course they would, right? On the other hand, Yanukovych, when he got elected in 2010, did so with enormous Russian support. It wasn't as if this was an election where the Russians stood by, the dice fell where they were, and they happened to get their guy in there. They pushed very hard to get him in there. Just as in 2004, they pushed very hard to have him fraudulently get elected. Now, we don't know what would happen if a pro-Russian regime were elected in Canada and Mexico. Most Americans don't give it much thought. It hasn't happened. It's unlikely to happen. That is a fair point. We do know that Russia has tried, and successfully, to put in a Russian client as the president of the United States. And they succeeded here. And that is one reason why so many, because the majority of the Americans never voted for Donald Trump, feel particular rancor towards Russia right now.
I think that shedding light on the Crimea situation was very interesting, suggesting that there's a lot more to the annexation of Crimea than Western coverage lets on. 82% of households in Crimea speak Russian, far more than speak Ukrainian. And when a plebiscite held in March of 2014 on whether Crimea should join Russia resulted in 95% of the pro-Russian vote. The UN General Assembly...
I wonder if we want to set an international precedent that when there's a community of people who speak a language different than the major language of the country, that somehow they're not citizens of that country or they can't be part of that country. That would raise a lot of problems for a lot of countries. Right?
So but the vote, the plebiscite vote, where 95% of the pro-Russia vote was overrun by the UN General Assembly led by the US.
And in a plebiscite that was not a free and fair election, with no international observers who were serious about it, they won overwhelmingly with Russian troops lining the streets. I don't see that as an acclamation of the Crimean people wanting Russia there. Now, having said that, I also believe that had there been an election before the vote, that side might have won. I mean, Crimean public opinion did lean towards Russia. There's no doubt about that. But the question is this how we're going to do foreign policy, right? We can think of lots of regions, of lots of countries where people there might say, you know what, on balance, we'd like to be part of another country, right? We can think of that. Almost every major country has communities like that. Is the precedent then that if a foreign power comes in with the military, has a plebiscite, that they can break that piece of the country off? Is that a precedent onto which not just the United States and not just Europe, but countries all over the world want to sign? That seems like a very, very dangerous precedent.
Really interesting talking to you, Lincoln. I think it's really important to have these discussions so that there is more insight, more context over such a complicated and certainly alarming situation. Thank you very much for that. Lincoln Mitchell there from Columbia University.